This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shemot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? This week's episode is dedicated in memory of Chana Feigal bat Bluma and Shlomo, Harriet Sasson, who passed away just a few weeks ago. She was an Eshet Chayil in every sense and took care of her personal family and community and the Jewish community at large. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor some of our Shemot episodes. Parshat Bo opens with the final three plagues, locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborns, and includes all of the formative instructions for the moments of Exodus, the Pesach sacrifice, the redemption of the animal and human firstborn, and how these mitzvot intertwine with the plague of the firstborn. In many ways, the plagues are really 9 plus 1, wherein the final one is performed by God himself and has a particularly tragic element to it. This will finally cinch the ability to leave Egypt and gives us the sense that the 9 plagues that preceded were really a build-up to this final moment. The Parsha is unusually occupied with setting the tone for how Pesach will be remembered in the future. It spends less time recording the events as they happen and much more detailing how they should be commemorated in the future. The Parsha is quite self-aware. These events should and will be formative for future generations. This commemoration, and what I think is one of our first principles of storytelling, will be the topic of our conversation today with the amazing Rachel Sharansky Danziger. A Jerusalem-born writer and educator, and clearly a returning podcast guest, she writes about Judaism, history, and life in Israel for the Times of Israel and other online venues, and explores storytelling in the Hebrew Bible as a teacher in Matan, Ma'ayan, Torah in Motion, and Pardis. Rachel, it's great to have you back.
Wonderful to be here with you, Yosefa.
It's really quite a pleasure, and this idea of storytelling, or sort of there's this tension between, I always say there's so much buildup about the first 9 plagues, and then we get to the last one, and it's like the moment itself we've been waiting for, and it kind of passes in about like 4 psukim, and then we spend a lot of time speaking about the mitzvot that we're given at this time, which are in and of itself, really the formative moment to be those who receive law. And then we have all these other laws that kind of make their way in there, and all these different commandments to remember this day, to tell it to our children. And so I'd love for you to sort of like jump into that and help us unpack what you think, what kind of ethic or idea is reflected here that we're supposed to take with us even beyond the formality of the law.
I think this tension between the brevity of the event itself and all the laws and stories and instructions surrounding it, because it's both before and after. It's before the moment we're told about how to remember it and what to do following it, and then after the moment we're told what to do about it and how to remember it. This tension or gap or contradiction invites us almost to take this moment out of context and to say, yes, for the Israelites experiencing the Exodus, this was the pinnacle, this was a climax, as we will see following the rest of Shemot, the first of many. But this is a pinnacle of a process that's been building up for them. But for us looking at it, it's more than that. It's something that we need to reflect on. It's something that we need to weave into our lives in some way. And the truth is that God and Moshe, and they're not speaking in the same voice actually here, and I'll talk about that in a minute, are the first to tell us that. Because unlike the other makot that are just followed by practical instructions for Moshe, do this, do that, here all the people receive a certain set of instructions on how to prepare for Makat Bechorot, and a set of instructions on what to do to commemorate it. And the interesting thing is that God gives them practical instructions, meaning you will have this and this holiday, and you will do these and these commandments, and this will be something that commemorates this particular moment in history that, as I said, is meant to be taken out of context. It's meant to be an extended experience throughout the generations. But then Moshe steps in and adds a very important and surprising element where he tells us basically, yes, you will do this, and then you will do these things to commemorate, and then when your children ask you, you will tell them this story. And this is a moment when storytelling, specifically, not just memory, not just rituals of remembrance, storytelling enters our national story. And by the way, I just want to say it's very interesting that it's Moshe Rabbeinu who brings it in, a person who started his career by stating, Lo ish dvarim anochi, I'm not a man of words, a person who didn't leave a strong mark as a father. His children never make it into the story as big characters, and in fact, later in Shoftim, we meet a maybe descendant of Moshe who's not particularly positive. So it's not that he's such a model for education as a father or a model of a speaker, at least in his own eyes, and yet he's the one who had enough sensitivity to where the people are to tell them what you need is to tell this story to your children in this particular way.
Yeah, I think two things about that. One is that in general, I think we could, spend a whole episode speaking about the way Moshe develops as first a person, like his identity development is a fascinating topic. We touched upon it a little bit in a previous episode, but also how he develops as a leader, right? Going from this very unsure, God has to remind him many, many times or fight with him that he was really capable. And throughout the plague episode, you see different moments where Moshe, for example, he goes out on a limb in one of them and he tells Paro, when it comes to the frogs, he says, they have this conversation and he says, it's going to end. Tomorrow it's going to end. And then he leaves from Paro and he turns to God and it's Vayitzak. It's the first time, many of the Parshatim say it's the first time he really davens to Hashem. And then it says that Hashem does Moshe's bidding, okay? Now, you can go with the idea, which is that, well, he knew it was going to end tomorrow because all plagues are 7 days long. That's Chazal. But the pshat is that he actually made this up. For the first time, Moshe says, it's, in the moment, I could do this. I understand how Paro works. I think I'm getting the system. And he says it's going to end tomorrow. We're created a deal here between me and Paro. And then he turns to God and says, please do what I said because I just promised this to Paro. And you have all these little moments in the plague story where you see Moshe kind of coming into himself, really. Now, it'll take much longer than just this Parsha, maybe a whole other book. But I think that this is a really important point. And here he's saying, and here we have Moshe becoming an educator. And all of a sudden Moshe is saying, this is a moment that we must realize that it's not just for here and now, but it's something that's going to be formative for everyone in the future generations. So I think just even in Moshe's trajectory as a leader, it's such an important point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would say more than that, it's also an important moment in his trajectory as a human being. If you think about it, Moshe is a person who lived through many ruptures. Mm-hmm. He, as a baby, lost his home and was raised in a home where he was the adopted son. And then he loses this home and he goes to Yitro's house. And again, he goes there and it's like a new chapter, totally new chapter. He left his identity behind, he left everything he had behind, and he has to start a new chapter in Midian. And then he has to do it again and become a leader out of the blue for the people. And I think there's something beautiful about the fact that the man who experienced so many ruptures is showing sensitivity to the difficulties and challenges that the people are about to experience in this moment of rupture. And this goes into what I think is the first role of storytelling here. It's before we even talk about storytelling as something that future generations will really factually engage in, and we do this to this day. We are the fulfillment of this statement. We live what Moshe tells the people here. But before it even does that, the idea of storytelling, I think, is his very sensitive and compassionate way to help the people get through the present moment, this Leil Shimurim that's before them, because we remember Yetziat Mitzrayim as this glorious liberation, which it was, but imagine what it was like for the people living through it.
Yeah, disaster, completely traumatic.
Trauma, rupture,
terrible,
losing everything watching people die, then living with the fear of, will we be taken back? Can we trust in God? God and Moshe know what's going on. Did the people know what's going on? Not so clear. Not so clear. Even if they knew, it's not so clear that they had full faith that they understand what's going on and that they're okay with it. And now they're basically asked to do something very scary. They're asked to kill, according to the Midrash, the gods of Egypt, and put their blood on the door where everyone can see it. And that's the only way to protect their firstborns from death. That's a terrifying proposition. And just because we know that, once they got through that, they went out of Egypt, that doesn't mean that they had confidence that they will. And imagine you're sitting there, you're hearing the cries of death. It's not... it's very clinical the way we read it, but it's not. It's a horrific moment in history, in Egyptian history for sure, but even for us, it's a moment of rupture. And when Moshe tells them, one day your children will ask you, why do you do this and that? And you will tell them, because we lived through this thing and we became free and God released us with these great miracles. Imagine how much comfort, how much solace this offers them. Because it tells them, first of all, that they will have children.
Yeah, I was going to say that piece. Exactly. They know that they're going to survive.
Exactly. They'll survive. Not only will they survive, they will have children. They will have children who will be removed enough from slavery to ask questions about it. That in and of itself is a huge promise.
Yeah.
I thought about it in a different context. Last year, my son goes to a school in the Old City, my little one. And at the end of first grade, a few months ago, they did this show. His school did this show in Migdal David. And I looked at all these little Israeli children running around Migdal David, clearly feeling very at home. And I thought, 4 generations ago, 3 generations ago, 2 generations ago, could people really believe that that our kids not only will know they're Jewish, live a Jewish life, but do it with such freedom, with such abandon, with such level of comfort? So this is the promise, I think. This is the promise that's inherent in this idea of storytelling. It's not just, you will have a good story to tell. It's you will have children, and it will be your role to pass on a story to them. And suddenly, this moment of rupture they're living through becomes still a moment of rupture, still a moment of trauma, still terrifying, but also a moment of heroism. One where they get to seize control of their fate, where they're partnering with God and birthing something huge and exciting into the world that will one day impress future generations. And I think that gift, the gift of having purpose, the gift of having intention, the gift of having a role, is something that is tied to the idea that they will go on having a role as, the carriers, the vessels, the
emissaries.
The emissaries responsible for this story.
I'm thinking about it in relation to the past year and a half a little bit, and I'm thinking about the difference, and I might have mentioned this on the podcast. I'm thinking about the difference between there's 2 ways often to cope with something that's very difficult, right? There is the focus in on the moment, because if you start thinking too broad, then you get lost. So focus in on the moment. You do what you got to do. Take care of whatever kid needs, has needs. They have a need, right? Do that. Breathe. Stay in the moment. And then there's the other piece, which I think when we have a moment to reflect and we are overwhelmed, that those who have definitely, I've seen this around me, those who see themselves as, as part of a story of redemption. I'm saying this, in the religious language, like they feel that they're part of a talich of geula. Certainly, whether it's like in the land of Israel or the Jewish story, that for that kind of broad view, it is easier, I think, a little bit to engage in all of the difficulty of the past year and a half. And if you're only thinking about what's happening right now and the political decisions or the defense decisions, then you can sink very quickly into that feeling of despair or that feeling of, where is this going? But for people who sort of have their eyes looking forward on something that's much bigger than themselves, I found that perspective, whether it's a crafted choice for people, or it's like the disposition or the outlook they grew up with, I think that it's really held people together in this time much more. Oh, I know where it came up. It came up in the Yosef story. We spoke about Yosef adopting sort of like his faith perspective. But I really look at that and I say, well, seeing yourself as part of a story both helps you now because you think like there's a purpose right now and I'm going to get through this. And it also is obviously going to serve something in the future, but it has the ability to sort of anchor you in the current scenario, because no matter what the immediate outcome is, you know that there's a broader outcome that kind of can make this all feel worth it.
Absolutely. In the very first days of the war, the rabbi of my shul, Rav David Ansbacher, started sharing videos with us, like recording himself in videos. Now, he was in a state of distress because his nephew, his sister's son, fell defending his home in Kerem Shalom on October 7th itself. And he was there supporting his sister through the process of Shiva, but he also found it in himself to try and give us strengthening words. And one of the first things he said, and I'll be grateful for this, I think, for the rest of my life, when somebody tells you what you need to hear at a certain moment, it's a gift that cannot be, it's more precious than rubies and pearls, as Mishlei says. One of the first things he says is that in his professional capacity, he works a lot with visitor centers of national sites. He helps design the visitor centers, design the story that's told in them. And he pointed out that in Israel, we have all these very sad sites where we had very difficult battles, where we lost people, and sometimes we lost the battle. And the people who design the visitor centers, the museum, that are meant to explain what it is you're seeing, constantly make the choice to end on hope, on a note of hope. You're shown the difficult parts, and then in the end, there's maybe a window that opens to a playground where kids are playing, or pictures of, the fields, the ripe wheat in the fields, or if you think about Yad Vashem even, you go out and you see, the forest and the Jerusalem and, rebirth, tkuma, rising up. And he said it's a conscious choice, and it's a conscious state of mind that we adopt when we look at the past. When we say, let's not just tell depressing stories, let's see how these difficult moments brought us to where we are today. But it's our responsibility to adopt this when we look at the future and at the present. And I held on to that throughout the war, and every time in the most horrible, most difficult moments, I remind myself, yes, but I believe that we're in a redemptive story. I believe that as a people, we will rise up. And I don't know exactly how it'll happen, and if it'll happen on the terms I want it to happen. I can't control that. But I do believe it'll happen, and that totally changed the story for me.
I guess I was curious if you could relate to the word truth when it comes to storytelling. There are so many ways to look at truth. We tend to look at truth in a very, very scientific kind of way, and then falsely apply it to other kinds of contexts and texts that it's not relevant for. But I guess I'm curious if you could, how does the word truth fit into this idea of storytelling?
It's a great question, first of all. I think when you talk about scientific truth, it's descriptive truth. It's truth of what is, how can we describe it in the most accurate terms. In storytelling, there is a musag, there's an idea of truth, but it's a prescriptive truth. And specifically in stories that are, foundational stories for identity, I'm not talking about Red Riding Hood, even though I think there are educational truth hidden there too. But the prescriptive truth, it revolves around the question, will this story serve the kind of future I want to live in, or the kind of future I want to form? And it does require artifice. Yeah. It requires
deciding to end with hope.
Deciding
that's
to end with hope.
That's a crafting.
Exactly. It's artifice. Stories are artificial. Tanakh, right? The stories, the divine stories that we're reading now. Do they cover everything? Is this a comprehensive survey of what people went through? Does it tell us everything exactly in the order in which it happened? No. It tells us a story that's crafted to teach us certain lessons, to inspire in us certain drives, to make us want to rise up to something. So it's not descriptive truth in the scientific sense, or maybe even in the legal sense that lawyers use, but it is prescriptive truth in that regard. And in a sense, I would argue that the word true here is perhaps the wrong word, in the sense that it's a message, it's a vision. The question is more, do we choose to be true to this vision? Not, is the vision true?
I think another difference that often comes up is the difference between true and truth, meaning, right, you have all of our stories, all of our formative stories reflect never-ending amounts of human truths, right? They reflect our greatest pitfalls, the most difficult, the things that we struggle with. And in the modern age, we tend to get very stuck on if something is true, when in fact that's an utterly irrelevant question. And a lot of things are true that aren't necessarily offering us any wisdom, or they don't guide us anywhere particularly meaningful or helpful. And I think that the true meaning, I love that you flip that and say, are we sort of living up to that truth? And I think also the difference between true and truth is also very important here.
And I would just strengthen your point here, or like add another layer to it and say that the question of is it true is extremely past focused.
Yes.
And the drama that we are meant as Jews to live is in the future. It's in the present and the future. We're supposed to draw upon the past, but our focus is not what happened. Our focus is what are we supposed to do to make good things happen now or later on. I mean, it's a very proactive religion, and I feel like if we focus too much on the question of truth, capital T truth, it locks us from looking forward. Whereas when we say, can we be true to this vision, it makes us go forward, which I think leads to what I think is a second role of storytelling here in Moshe's speech to the people. And that's a role that's really not going to be relevant in this moment, but it's a role that's going to become very important later on. And I need to take a step back to explain why before I talk about it. Rashar Hirsch, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, points out in numerous places in his commentary on the Torah that there's this tremendous gap between what the Torah expects of us, the grandeur of the vision it offers, the kind of refinement of the self that it requires, the level of, partnership with God that it demands of us, the level of bringing God into the smallest details of our lives, the level of creativity and compassion and devotion that is expected to make it work, to live up to it. There's a tremendous gap between all of that and where the people actually are at the moment of the Exodus. And I mean, they're slaves. They just came out. They're afraid. They're not trained to think in these terms. The idea of you refine yourself until you reach a certain level is new to them. And in that regard, it's not that Cheta Egel and Cheta Meraglim are, predetermined, but some sort of failures are. They're doomed to fail. And that's a very harsh truth. It's a difficult truth to make peace with. And here I do say truth. But as Rashar Hirsch points out, this truth is really an invitation, or this gap is an invitation to reframe for ourselves what the Torah is all about. It's not about you must be perfect right now. It's about creating the vision that will then require what he calls hundreds, if not thousands of years of education to help us generation by generation, individual by individual, raise ourselves up to the level where we can embrace this vision fully. And he even says in one place in Bamidbar that it's past our own time. Like it's not, this effort is not over. Even when he's writing in the 19th century, it's not over. We're still in that process. In other words, he's reframing our relationship with Torah, our relationship with God as a journey. That, it's okay that we started at a low point and then we work our way up. That's the way it's supposed to be. But how? How do you educate people to raise themselves? It's easy to force people to do things if you're willing to use violence or force. It's easy to tell people, now you must do this, and if not, this and this will happen to you. But if you're trying to raise a people whose role is to take initiative, to be, people who mehalchim, go walk before God, as God says about King David, for example, that people who understand God's mission to us well enough to then take it and run with it, that can't be done by force. That can't be done by rote. That can't be done by making our kids, lishanen, how to recite lists or recite commandments. That's not enough. You need to somehow raise people who choose to then continue on this path and keep raising themselves. Rashar Hirsch likens it to the way the high priest lights the menorah. So there's this idea that when he lights the menorah, the Kohen Gadol is supposed to somehow bring the flame close to the wick, but then let the fire light almost on its own. Me'aleha.
Yeah.
And he says that's the model for education. The role of the educator is not to force ideas and so on. It's to make them choose that path, choose these ideas for themselves. And how do you do that? And I think Moshe Rabbeinu is giving us the key to that here. In And the key is storytelling. But it's not storytelling by way of, let me tell you our story, A, B, C, the end. We close the book and put it away. No, it's we tell the story by listening to the places where our children question us. Looking for the moments when they come up with a question, when they feel curiosity, when they're opening themselves up. And then telling them the story. Then giving them, crafting with artifice, crafting the story in a way that will touch the questioning, yearning, curious part in their soul. In other words, it requires listening. It requires a relationship, because it's not enough to just come and dump the idea on someone. You have to really develop the kind of relationship that allows you to notice when they're open, and for them to trust you, I believe, as well. And it requires the willingness to go on telling the story over and over again, however many times it takes. I mean, Moshe Rabbeinu starts this mission of teaching the people this method here. He then develops it much more in Deuteronomy, in Sefer Devarim, where he over and over again warns them that if they don't tell this story, if they don't educate the people, then their children, their grandchildren will forget what they're supposed to be doing in the world, will sink into a sort of complacency, forget to uphold the covenant, and pay the costs, pay the price.
I love that piece about you have to look for those moments when they ask, right? I think we often don't focus on that piece of the pasuk, right? It's when they ask you, because we focus on it in the halachic sense, which is that we have an obligation to say it at a certain time. But it's such a great point. I would reflect here just as a parent that it's always, those are like those golden moments when your kid comes to you and they volunteer, right? They ask you a question, or they open up a conversation. And in the few times you're like, I haven't been able to, or like my brain was just too fuzzy, and I thought to myself, such a missed opportunity, because like that's when the child actually really wanted to engage in that conversation. It's usually well after when I want to be in bed. And you know, they're really critical points. And I just, it's a great book, and I wanted to throw it in here. There's one of my favorite children's book, and I read a lot of them that I don't like. So a great children's book is a book in Hebrew that's called Aryeh ben Naim ha-nireli ha-14. The Aryeh ben Naim, the 14th, okay? And it's basically this book about this little boy. He's in a gan. It clearly is depicting like in Tel Aviv. And he has what he calls the name of a Saba, okay? And all the other kids have these like very light names, and it's just chill, and they give all these funny examples. But these kids in Ghana have these normal names, right, quote unquote. And he comes home and he's like, why can't I just have a normal name? And his mother says, well, you're named after your Saba, who's alive, meaning his Saba's alive. And then his Saba comes to visit, and he said, you know, I heard that you don't like your name. And he's like, I think it's time to take out the book. And they take out a book, and it's basically a book with pictures of like the past 14 generations of their family with a patriarch named, Aryeh. And so and one's a boxer, and one's a pirate, and they have all these different, one's just a shoemaker, but he was a great storyteller. And by the end of this explanation, he looks at his grandson, he's like, but if you want to change your name, it's really okay. You could change your name. It's like, no, I think actually Aryeh is a great name. And the point is, it's a beautiful book. And the point is that the grandfather, when the son opened up that, his grandson opened up this, gripe he has about his name, he said, you're part of a tradition. You're part of like this unbelievable chain of phenomenal men named Aryeh. And so maybe it's not super common in your gun, and the beautiful part is that he didn't say that to him, meaning it was a story, and he invited his grandson into the story. And then the grandson all of a sudden feels part of something. And the last page of the book it's his picture, that they put up his picture in this family photo album. And it's exactly that piece. It's sort of like putting yourself, but it starts with the grandson saying like, what's this name? Like, I don't like this name. And then, oh, well, I have a story to tell you about all these men. And I think that that's such a profound point of like being able to take those opportunities and like not to lose, like don't take the halachic fact of like, this is when we have to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And with that, like lose the tree, for the forest. Like it's those unbelievable moments when your kid asks you to reflect on your family history, that like that's the moment to do that.
First of all, I need to get this book.
It's an amazing book, Rachel.
Sounds amazing.
There are so few that I like that particularly come out of this publisher that I was like blown away by how much I liked it.
It sounds amazing. And what I especially like, and I think that cuts to the heart of what storytelling is, good storytelling as Moshe tells us to engage in. There are also forms of bad storytelling. Maybe we can say something about that later.
Okay.
Is that at the end of the day, the grandfather leaves the choice in the grandson's hands. And this is huge, because I think that true storytelling of the sort Moshe is offering is exactly about inviting the people and their children to enter a partnership.
Yeah.
And a partnership is scary because when you, as a parent, allow yourself to enter a partnership with your children and not just, a parent-child relationship where you're on top and they have to do what you say, you may have to change. You may have to change the way you do things. But by inviting them into this partnership, you make it that when they choose what to do, it'll be their choice. It'll be their initiative. In other words, you're allowing yourself to do what the high priest did with the fire in the Rashar Hirish metaphor. You're creating an environment where they can make it their own. And I think that, by the way we tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim in the Seder is meant to reproduce that. Because if you think about it, it's a very odd way to tell the story. It's not like, it's such an easy story to tell in a beginning, middle, end. We were enslaved, and then God saved us, and we were happy, and we sang by the ocean, the end. Think Prince of Egypt, for example.
Yes.
Right? It's easy to tell this story.
They made order of the story in a way that the Haggadah never did.
Exactly. The Haggadah goes against the grain of this tendency to look for the organized, nice, easily framed story arc, breaks it apart, forces us to engage with different parts in different ways, forces us to do it together in the nexus of relationships of the people sitting around the table, and stops us from turning it into this beautiful but ultimately long gone story. And rather makes us retell it as our own story, invites us to come into it. In storytelling, there's this quality that many storytellers aspire to, which is to create a story that transports you. It needs to be transportive, meaning like it needs to take you somewhere. And I think that the storytelling that Moshe offers or invites us to engage in, and the storytelling that the Seder invites us to engage in, is not transportive at all, because it forces us to take the bits of the story and work them into our own lives. It's transformative, but it's not transportive. It keeps us grounded in reality, because at the end of the day, and that's what I said before when we talked about prescriptive truth, and the story that is important is a story that we will create moving forward.
Right. That's a piece I wanted to ask about because, in the broader world right now, it's very much spoken about how many countries are lacking a national narrative, and it's what's created a lot of just dissolving of connection between citizens of all different countries. And obviously in Israel, we have a whole host of different situations and circumstances. But I guess, you already partially spoke to it, but I'd like to just highlight it a little bit, because when I hear somebody, talking about our national story, I do sometimes see a tendency for people to say something like, people always wanted to destroy us and they always will destroy us. And sometimes what happens with a story, even if we're part of the next chapter of it, we can actually get stuck inside that story. And I've been thinking a lot. I've been thinking a lot about how even I will be a little bit connected to the current reality we are in the moment. I do not know what it'll be in 2 weeks when this episode airs, but I've been thinking a lot about Moshe's negotiation with Paro, and what it means to literally kiviyachol negotiate with the devil when you already know the ending of the story. And I think there's some interesting take-homes there. But then I say to myself, maybe you're getting stuck. Maybe your biblical prism, Yosefa, is so strong for you because it's what you eat, breathe, teach all the time, that it actually, I don't know, is it instructive or is it actually keeping me stuck inside of something that I'm not supposed to, that it's kind of shackling me from seeing something differently? And I guess I wanted to ask you that question because as you're saying, we have to continue the story. It's not a static story. But sometimes I wonder how much retelling actually creates this very clear imprint of our mind of we already know where this is going to go. There's going to be different iterations of it and different characters, but it's basically a story that repeats itself.
I think it's definitely a danger. It's a danger and I also live very, immersed in Tanakh and constantly going back to the stories of Tanakh. And I think it's definitely a danger, not just to get stuck, but also to stop seeing reality as it is sometimes. We look at it through the prism of past events and we fail to notice that right now it's different and requires different things. That said, I think that that's why there should be an ethics of storytelling. And I'm not saying that like, oh, we should define it and have a Serta Dibrot of how to tell our story and follow it. But I think that we have to ask ourselves, how do we tell the story? How do we live the story? And is this a way that serves us or doesn't serve us? For example, Rabbi Sachs has this whole discussion in his book Future Tense. He references it in other places as well, about the right story and the wrong story. And he actually says that this story of at every generation...
Yeah, he hates that story.
He hates that story.
Yeah, I know.
Yes. For him, that's the wrong story.
Yes.
Not because it's factually not true, but because it doesn't serve us.
Exactly.
And he says there's a bigger, deeper story we can tell or we can believe in, which is a story of the promise of the Jewish people to the world. And if we tell that story, we can still talk about all the people who try to oppress or kill us or destroy us and try and make sense and make meaning out of it. But it gives us a totally different horizon to aspire to. I think that I would caution that you can go too far with that approach. You can start telling untrue stories because you think they serve the future you want to live in. And by untrue, I mean really untrue. Things that just don't fit the facts that happen, things that don't fit what happened in the descriptive sense of truth. And if you allow yourself to go too far in that direction, what happens is that the stories stop being meaningful because they become legend, they become myth, they become, fairy tale. How different is it from a Disney movie at some point? And then it no longer has the power to project a vision into the future. It's like, oh, a nice inspirational tale.
I even want to give like a very specific example in what I think maybe you're referring to, and you'll tell me if this is correct or not. But even in the way that in the past decade, maybe a bit more, that a particular group of people in America have decided they're not making up a story about the origins of America, but they have completely changed their perspective on what that story is, right? Nobody ever hid the fact that the Indians were mistreated, abused, murdered, right? That was never hid. But the perspective on that story has really, really lowered that story that I was taught, for years as a kid in school, the Pilgrim story. We could talk about it in our sleep, that it totally derails the story from having meaning for a whole generation of people. And it's true. But then the issue is that both could be true. It could be true that there was immorality that was a part of that story, just like immorality is part of our origin stories in all different ways, whether modern or ancient. But the question is, like, how can you preserve that story so that it be triumphant, that it be inspiring, while you could often then have a modern lens that goes back and says, I'm kind of going to process that story a little bit differently now than they might have done in the past.
So kind of in line with that, I think the jury is still out. Like, this is a new movement and we have to see where it goes.
Yeah.
But
vis-a-vis the American story.
Vis-a-vis the American
that's
story.
A biblical one.
Yeah, but I would say that, if I did try to write a 10 commandments of storytelling, of ethical storytelling, or useful, strengthening, positive storytelling, one of those commandments would have to be look for complexity. Because I think the disease that plagues the way some Americans tell their stories and some Jews tell their stories, and it goes beyond that, and I'll be very careful because I'm not trying to imply any particular person or organization is complicit in that, but I do think it's a phenomena that's happening. One of the things that plagues it is the search for this kind of ideological simplicity that doesn't serve anything good. Like, making one side all villains and one side all saints, and ignoring anything that doesn't fit what you want to believe in. That is not inspiration. That is like redesigning your inner world to match some idea you hold, and it no longer has the ability to reflect any truth or meaning or challenge to you, because it's all created from you. Meaning it's I would say it's almost, again, I want to be very careful, but I want to say there's almost a little bit of a taste of Avodah Zarah in it, because the idea that you create your gods, you design a world in which all the stories, all the tools, all the parts that are supposed to give you meaning are just projections of your belief system. I think that what makes Tanakh a story that's true in the sense that it's prescriptive truth, in the sense that it takes us to somewhere better, is that it's challenging.
Yeah.
It's not an easy story.
It also famously rarely will label somebody a Rasha or a Tzaddik in the Torah stories.
Exactly.
There's a whole Tzvi Shimoni, who taught me a little bit when back in the day I was in Bar Ilan. He wrote, definitely was a doctorate, I'm not sure if it became a book, about gray figures, that even in every story where somebody could be portrayed as a Rasha or someone as a Tzaddik, there always was a middle figure. He called it like the gray figure in the story. He presents Lot as being that in the stories of Abraham. But I think that it's really an important piece. Like Yaakov being a tzaddik and Esav being a rasha is actually Chazal's worldview. It's not really so well reflected in the Pshat itself. So I think that that's a really important point.
And it goes back to what I was saying before about inviting people into a partnership. Because if the story is so simple that it's just, politically correct, ideologically correct, everything about it is perfect projection of what you want to believe about the world, you're no longer a needed part of it. Like, it just is.
Yeah.
Whereas stories that challenge, stories that demand thought, that demand us to question what does it require of us moving forward and how do we understand it looking back, that's stories that invoke or inspire initiative. And at the end of the day, it seems to me that all of Tanakh is aimed at creating people who take initiative, because how can we have a covenant with God and be partners in a covenant with God if we can't walk before Him, if we can't carry the torch on our own?
I think also for me, that's one of the, and I do, Tanakh teaching, but I spend a lot of time in the halachic world also and other roles of mine in life. And I think that the thing I see the most in my students when they, in one area that I teach, I help students basically read through all of Nevi'im and Ketuvim over the span of a few months. And one of the things that I love the most about Tanakh and why I love hanging out in the story is that exact piece, is that other realms like halacha, as just one as an example, you kind of have to get to a bottom line piece. And the thing I love about learning and teaching Tanakh is that you really should never get to a bottom line piece, meaning each time and every time I teach something, it comes out totally different. And the point I want to bring out from it is something totally different. And that is like the wealth that is storytelling. And I think that there are interpretations that are beyond the pale. I think that there are things that could be wrong and incorrect. It doesn't mean that everything goes at all, but I think that piece is such an important one, and it's what challenges. I see it challenging young students when they first meet it. They're like, "What do I do with this?" Or "How do I box it in?" I'm like, "You can't box it in. There's nothing to do about it. It's really, really complex." Yes, and he is one of our heroes. Indeed, he did that, and he's one of our heroes. And it's really, really, really difficult.
And that's what lends elasticity and ultimately durability to the Torah.
Yeah.
Because if all we had were stiff laws, then how do we handle new realities? Yeah. How do we handle new challenges? But we have stories. Moshe tells us, tell the story. Listen to the children's questions and then answer them with a story. But the children's question presumably will change. They'll change with every generation because they will be in a different place. And so we will have to change along with, we the carriers of the story, have to change along with it because it's about education. It's about growth. I love that piece.
No, I love that piece because I asked you before, how do we not get stuck in the story? And that's a great point because the questions themselves change, right? As we just said, the questions have changed. I'm going to use the American story just as our scapegoat in this conversation, right? The questions have changed. Now, the question itself, I don't think is a bad one. I think it's a good question. But then the question is, how does that interact with the central place that story has in tradition? Like, do you just throw out the story? Do you have to shift the tradition, right? So again, in our Torah world, we're going to have different responses to that question. But I think that that's such an important point. The questions themselves shift. I'm sure you think about this often also, like when you're preparing a shir and all of a sudden you start thinking about like these new ideas you've been learning in another realm and how they're impactful now and how you see Torah, right? That's how a lot of us moderns are teaching Torah. And I think to myself, 5 years ago, I would never have thought that when I read this pasuk because it just wasn't and that's the vibrancy of it. It's how that is interacting. I think that's such a great point, that it's the questions that shift as well, and that will challenge and hopefully expands also the story itself. Yeah,
and that's what makes it Torat Chaim and not a dead story that we can close and put on the shelf and move on with our lives.
Yeah. Rachel, we're gonna wrap up our conversation, but I wanted to ask you a question, which is a little bit sticky. I'll just say also, I don't mind saying for listeners that we're recording this like as some sort of hostage deal is kind of like happening. And I don't know, I haven't checked the news this morning, so I don't exactly know what's going on at the moment. But so we're in a particular moment, although we are trying to see broadly, right, the moment that we're in. And this series, which is really focusing on sort of these first principles, and I would say very clearly, right, the first principle we're coming out with from this conversation is a principle of storytelling. Last week we came out with a first principle of egalitarianism, which was an interesting conversation. And I guess I'm curious how you might take any of the pieces that we sort of brought up today, and that you kind of see that you would like to see them sort of realigned or adjusted in the future. You could pick, we touched upon so many different ideas, but I'm just curious, what is it in conversation with what you spoke about today that you feel like this is something that could use some shifting, some filing, some polishing?
It's an excellent question, Yosefa, and a challenging one. We talk about the value of challenges, so now I have to live up to what I said and enjoy the challenge instead of being daunted by it. I'll say this. I think that the past year and a half, really 2-3 years, showed us that on some level, we may no longer share the same basic story here in Israel. And that our versions of who we are and who we're supposed to be as a nation are very different. And we saw it in the arguments is a gentle word, surrounding the judicial reform before the war. We see it now with the arguments surrounding the hostage deal. And it's very painful, because it's like we're using the same ideas. Like we all talk about Pidyon Shvu'im and Kedushat HaChaim, but we mean different things.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'd like to see is not for one group to give up on its origin story or how they see the story, but for all of us to take a step back and look deeper and see that all those stories still stem from the same basic narrative. And I think that if we can hold that awareness, if we can remind ourselves that the reason our words sound similar, even if we mean them differently, is because they came from the same story. If we remind ourselves that this story was always meant to be challenging and complicated and demand different responses at different times, maybe, I'm not sure, but I hope we will be able to hold more productive conversations. We will be able to, even when we disagree, and I am under no illusion that we will suddenly agree about everything. And if I was under this illusion, I'll be disillusioned in a second. But maybe we'll be able to remember that there's value in trying to work it out together. And I'll say more than that. 2 months ago, our community lost a very beloved member, Rav Avi Goldberg. In the year before the war, Rav Avi and his wife Rachel held these meetings in their home where they invited supporters and opponents of the judicial reform to come and talk. And my father, Natan Sharansky, went to one of the meetings. And we talked about it at the time, but then life moved on, then we had a war, then, I forgot about it. But then he himself mentioned it in the Shiva tent. He shared with Rachel what this conversation meant for him. And he said that what was remarkable when they sat there in the Goldberg house and talked, people with very different positions about the reform, but really about religion and state and what kind of, and should we be more Jewish or more democratic, like all these big, incompatible positions, is that by the end of the evening, nobody agreed with the others, but they all wanted to keep talking. They sat well past midnight and just kept talking and talking and talking because something about this encounter reminded them that we're together in it. Mm-hmm. And I think that the story of Tanakh has the ability to remind us of that if we let it. And what I hope is, what I pray for really, is that we let it. We let it not change us, not make it easier for us. It's not an easy story, and it's not an easy vision, and it's not an easy path ahead of us. It's not a journey that anyone in his right mind would say, ooh, fun, let's do that. But it's our story. It's our journey. It's our vision. And if we remember that this R encompasses us all, I hope that we can go about disagreeing within it in a different way.
Rachel, thank you for that. And thank you for this entire conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Safa. It's good to be here with you in this storm of this moment.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.